I never thought I'd hear someone ask me to stop performing my own life. But that's exactly what Steven said to me in the middle of a busy farmer's market in downtown Baton Rouge, standing between stalls of tomatoes and homemade jam. He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like someone offering water to a person who didn't know they were thirsty. If this story means something to you, I hope you'll subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. My name is Burke Morrison, and for most of my adult life, I've been good at being what people needed. I worked as a quality assurance coordinator for a regional office supply distribution company. It's the kind of job where you check boxes, follow procedures, and make sure everything runs exactly as it should. No surprises, no mess. I was very good at it. I lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a quiet neighborhood called Garden District, not far from the LSU campus. My apartment was on Terrace Avenue, a street lined with live oaks and front porches where people sat in the evenings. I'd lived there for 6 years. My neighbors knew me as polite, reliable, and private. I didn't host parties, I didn't make noise. I was the guy who always said yes when someone needed help moving furniture or watering plants while they were away. I had a boyfriend named Colton. We'd been together for 3 years. He was a sales manager for a medical equipment company, clean-cut, confident, easy to introduce to people. We went to dinners with his coworkers. We attended fundraisers. We looked good together in photos. When people asked how we were doing, I always said we were fine. And we were fine. That was the word I used most often, but fine isn't the same as true. I met Stephen Lawson on a Thursday morning in May at a community meeting about urban green space development. The meeting was held in a public library branch on Government Street. And I'd only gone because my manager thought it would be good for our company to show interest in local sustainability initiatives. I sat in the back with a notepad I didn't really need. Stephen arrived late, carrying a canvas bag and a reusable coffee cup. He worked as a horticultural extension coordinator for the parish, which meant he helped people design community gardens and managed educational programs about native plants. He looked like someone who spent time outdoors. His hair was a little too long, his shirt was wrinkled, and he had dirt under his fingernails. He didn't apologize for being late. He just sat down and started listening. After the meeting, he came up to me. He said he noticed I'd been taking notes and asked if I had any questions about the green space proposals. I didn't, not really, but I said something polite about wanting to understand the environmental impact. He smiled, not in a polished way, but in a way that felt like he actually cared about the answer. We ended up talking for 20 minutes in the library parking lot. He told me about a project he was working on to restore native wetland plants along the Mississippi River Levee. I told him about my job, though I kept it brief. He didn't seem bored. He asked follow-up questions. When I mentioned I lived near LSU, he said he lived in Spanish Town, a neighborhood just a few blocks from mine. Before we left, he handed me his card and said if I ever wanted to see the wetland project, I should reach out. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I kept the card. 2 weeks later, I texted him. I told myself it was because I was curious about the project. That wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He responded within an hour and invited me to meet him that Saturday at the Levee access point off River Road. The morning was warm and humid, typical for late May in Louisiana. I met him at a gravel lot near the Levee. He was wearing boots and a faded shirt with the parish logo on it. He greeted me like we were old friends. We walked along the levee and he pointed out different plants, explaining which ones were native and which were invasive. He talked about soil composition, water flow, and seed dispersal. I didn't understand half of it, but I liked listening to him. At one point, we stopped near a stand of young, bald cypress trees. He knelt down and touched the base of one, explaining how their root systems help stabilize the soil. I stood there watching him and I realized I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt awake. After that, we started meeting regularly. Not dates, just meetings. Coffee on Saturday mornings, walks along the levee, lunch at a Vietnamese place on Government Street. I didn't tell Colton about Stephen, not because I was hiding anything, but because there was nothing to hide. Stephen was a friend, that's what I told myself. Stephen never asked intrusive questions, but he had a way of noticing things. One afternoon in June, we were sitting on a bench near the old state capitol looking out at the river. I just finished telling him about a project at work, something about vendor compliance audits. He listened, nodded, and then said, "Do you actually like that job?" The question caught me off guard. I said, "It's fine, it's stable." He didn't push, but he gave me this look like he'd heard what I didn't say. Another time, we were walking through the Red Stick Farmers Market downtown, near 5th Street. It was a Saturday morning, and the market was crowded with people buying produce, flowers, and handmade goods. I was telling him about a dinner party Colton and I had attended the night before. I was doing what I always did, shaping the story to sound pleasant and uncomplicated. Stephen stopped walking. He turned to me and said, "You don't have to do that." I frowned. "Do what?" "Perform," he said. "You don't have to make everything sound fine, not with me." I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't defensiveness, it was recognition. He'd named something I'd been doing for so long I didn't even notice it anymore. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. We kept walking, but his words stayed with me. By July, I was spending more time with Stephen than with Colton. Colton didn't seem to notice. He was busy with work, traveling for sales conferences, meeting clients. When we were together, we talked about logistics, dinner plans, upcoming events. We didn't talk about anything that mattered. One evening, Colton and I were sitting in my apartment. He was on his phone, scrolling through emails. I was reading a book I wasn't really absorbing. I looked at him and realized I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't know if he was happy. I didn't know if I was happy, I just knew we were together and that had felt like enough, but it wasn't anymore. I started to notice the differences between how I felt with Colton and how I felt with Stephen. With Colton, I was careful. I measured my words. I avoided conflict. I performed the role of the good boyfriend, the stable partner. With Stephen, I didn't have to do that. He asked me what I thought, and he actually waited for the answer. He disagreed with me sometimes, and it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like conversation. One afternoon in early August, Stephen and I drove out to Cat Island National Wildlife Refuge, about an hour south of Baton Rouge. We hiked along a boardwalk trail through bald cypress swamp. The air was thick and green, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional splash of something moving through the water. We stopped at an observation platform. Stephen leaned against the railing, looking out at the trees. I stood next to him, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but I couldn't answer it. He didn't press, he just waited. Finally, I said, "I don't know." He turned to look at me. "That's an answer," he said quietly. I felt something break open inside me, not in a painful way, in a way that felt like relief. That night, I lay awake in bed next to Colton, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Stephen's question. I thought about the life I'd built, the person I'd been pretending to be. I thought about what it would mean to stop. The next morning, I told Colton we needed to talk. Ending things with Colton was harder than I expected, not because I wasn't sure, but because I'd never done anything like it before. I'd never been the one to walk away. I'd never chosen discomfort over stability. We sat on the couch in my apartment. I told him I didn't think we were right for each other anymore. I told him I'd been feeling disconnected for a long time and that it wasn't fair to either of us to keep pretending. He didn't seem surprised. He asked if there was someone else, and I said no, which was technically true. Stephen and I hadn't crossed any line, but I knew, and I think Colton knew, that someone else wasn't the point. He moved out 2 weeks later. The breakup was quiet, civil, almost businesslike. People who knew us said we handled it maturely. I suppose we did, but maturity doesn't make something easy. I didn't reach out to Stephen right away. I needed time to sit with who I was without Colton, without the performance I'd been maintaining. I needed to figure out what I actually wanted. But Stephen didn't disappear. He texted me a few days after Colton moved out, asking if I wanted to grab coffee. I said yes. We met at a place called Highland Coffees on Highland Road. It was a weekday afternoon and the shop was quiet. We sat outside under the shade of a magnolia tree. Stephen didn't ask me about Colton. He didn't ask me what had happened. He just asked how I was doing. I told him the truth. I said I felt unmoored but also lighter, like I'd put down something I'd been carrying for too long. He nodded. That makes sense. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. That's okay, he said. You don't have to know yet. Over the next few weeks, Stephen and I kept spending time together. We didn't call it dating, but it felt different than before. There was a new kind of awareness between us, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there when I was still with Colton. We went to a concert at the Manship Theater downtown. We had dinner at a Cajun place on Perkins Road. We drove out to the Bluebonnet Swamp Nature Center and walked the trails in the late afternoon heat. Everything felt easy with him in a way nothing had felt easy in a long time. One evening in September, we were sitting on the levee near the USS Kidd Museum, watching the sun set over the Mississippi River. The sky was orange and pink, and the air had finally started to cool. Stephen said, "Can I tell you something?" I looked at him. "Of course. I've been interested in you since the day we met," he said. "I didn't say anything because I knew you were with someone. But I need you to know that whatever this is, it matters to me." My heart was pounding. "It matters to me too," he smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "I don't want to rush anything," he said. "But I also don't want to pretend I don't feel what I feel." "I don't want to pretend either," I said. He reached over and took my hand. It was the first time we'd touched like that, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. After that, we started calling it what it was. We were together. Not in the careful, curated way I'd been with Colton, but in a way that felt real. Stephen introduced me to parts of Baton Rouge I'd never explored. We went to poetry readings at the library. We visited the LSU Rural Life Museum. We spent Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, buying vegetables and talking to the vendors Stephen knew by name. He had a way of making ordinary things feel meaningful. He also challenged me in ways I wasn't used to. One afternoon, we were at his apartment in Spanish Town, a small, cluttered place filled with plants and books. He was making lunch and I was sitting at his kitchen table telling him about a frustrating situation at work. When I finished, he said, "What do you actually want to do about it?" I blinked. "What do you mean? You just spent 10 minutes telling me what happened," he said. "But you didn't say what you want. What do you want?" I realized I didn't know. I'd been so focused on managing the situation, on doing what was expected, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself what I actually wanted. "I don't know," I said. "Then maybe that's where you start," he said gently. It was a small moment, but it stayed with me. Stephen had this way of asking questions that made me think about who I was and who I wanted to be. He didn't try to change me, but he didn't let me hide either. By October, I'd started making changes. Small ones at first. I stopped saying yes to things I didn't want to do. I started speaking up in meetings at work. I signed up for a woodworking class at a community center on Government Street, something I'd always been curious about but had never made time for. Stephen supported all of it. He didn't make a big deal out of any of it. He just showed up and paid attention. One Saturday, we drove out to St. Francisville, a small town about 30 miles north of Baton Rouge. We visited Rosedale Plantation, walked through the gardens, and had lunch at a cafe on Royal Street. On the way back, we stopped at a roadside stand and bought boiled peanuts. We sat in Stephen's truck parked on the side of the road, eating peanuts and watching the sun dip below the tree line. I felt a kind of contentment I hadn't known I was missing. "Thank you," I said. He looked at me. "For what?" "For asking me to be authentic," I said. "For not letting me get away with performing," he smiled. "You did the hard part. I just asked the question." "Still," I said. "Thank you." He leaned over and kissed me, and it felt like coming home. Not everything was perfect. There were moments when I slipped back into old habits, when I found myself shaping my words to avoid conflict or discomfort. But Stephen noticed, and he called me on it gently but firmly. And I got better at catching myself, at pausing and asking what I actually thought, what I actually felt. In November, I was offered a promotion at work. It came with more responsibility, more visibility, and more money. A year ago, I would have taken it without question. But when my manager told me about it, the first thing I felt wasn't excitement. It was dread. I talked to Steven about it that night. We were sitting on his porch, wrapped in blankets against the cool evening air. "Do you want the promotion?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't think I do." "Then don't take it." "It's not that simple," I said. "People expect me to take it. It's the logical next step." "For who?" he asked. I didn't have an answer. The next day, I turned down the promotion. I told my manager I appreciated the offer, but I didn't think it was the right fit for me at this time. He was surprised, but he respected my decision. I felt terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. That evening, Steven and I celebrated with takeout from a Thai place on Airline Highway. We sat on the floor of my apartment, eating pad Thai and spring rolls, and I felt lighter than I had in years. "I'm proud of you," Steven said. "I'm proud of me too," I said, and I meant it. By December, I'd started thinking about what I actually wanted to do with my life. I loved the woodworking class I'd been taking. I loved working with my hands, creating something tangible. I started researching furniture-making programs, apprenticeships, ways I could turn a hobby into something more. It felt impossible and exciting at the same time. Steven never told me what to do. He just asked questions, listened, and believed I could figure it out. One night, we were lying in bed in his apartment. The room was dark except for the glow of streetlights coming through the window. I was tracing patterns on his shoulder and he was almost asleep. "Steven," I said. "I love you." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "I love you too." It was the first time either of us had said it. It felt right. By January, I'd made a decision. I was going to leave my job and enroll in a furniture-making program at a trade school in New Orleans. It was a one-year intensive program, and it started in March. I'd have to commute at least at first, but it felt like the right move. I told Steven over dinner at a restaurant called Elsie's Plate and Pie on Chime Street. I was nervous about his reaction, not because I thought he'd be unsupportive, but because it was such a big change. He listened, and when I finished, he smiled. "That's incredible. You think so?" "I know so," he said. "You're doing something that actually matters to you. That's not small." I felt a rush of relief and gratitude. The next few weeks were a blur of logistics. I gave notice at my job. I applied for the program and was accepted. I started looking into housing options in New Orleans, though Steven suggested I keep my apartment in Baton Rouge and commute until I was sure I wanted to relocate. He also reminded me that New Orleans was only an hour away and that we'd figure it out. In February, we took a weekend trip to New Orleans to scout out the area around the trade school. The school was in the Bywater neighborhood, a colorful, artsy area near the river. We walked around, had coffee at a place on Royal Street, and visited a few furniture studios. I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. This was real. I was actually doing this. That night, we stayed at a small bed and breakfast in the Marigny. We sat on the balcony, drinking wine and watching people pass by on the street below. "Are you scared?" Steven asked. "Terrified," I admitted. "Good," he said. "That means it matters." I looked at him. "What if I fail?" "Then you'll figure out what's next," he said. "But you won't fail. You're too stubborn," I laughed. "Is that a compliment?" "Absolutely." We sat there for a while, not saying anything, just being together. I thought about how much my life had changed in less than a year. I thought about who I'd been when I met Steven and who I was becoming. I thought about what it meant to be authentic, to stop performing, to show up as myself even when it was uncomfortable. I thought about love and how it wasn't about being perfect or easy. It was about being seen and seeing someone else in return. In March, I started the program. The commute was long but manageable. The work was challenging in the best way. I was learning how to use tools I'd never touched before, how to read wood grain, how to build something from nothing. Steven visited me in New Orleans on weekends. We explored the city together, tried new restaurants, visited galleries. He met some of my classmates and charmed every single one of them. In April, I built my first piece of furniture, a simple side table made of oak. It wasn't perfect. The joints were a little loose and the finish was uneven, but it was mine. I'd made it with my own hands. I sent Steven a photo. He responded immediately, "I'm so proud of you." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a swell of emotion I couldn't quite name. By June, I decided to move to New Orleans full-time. I found a small apartment in the Bywater just a few blocks from the school. Steven helped me move, hauling boxes up a narrow staircase in the summer heat. That night, we sat on the floor of my empty apartment, eating pizza and drinking beer. "You doing okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." "Good, what about us?" I asked. "You're still in Baton Rouge, I'm here, how do we make this work?" "We'll figure it out," he said. "We've figured out everything else." And we did. Steven started spending weekends in New Orleans. I went back to Baton Rouge during the week sometimes. We talked every day. We made it work because we both wanted to. In August, Steven got a job offer in New Orleans. It was a position with a nonprofit focused on urban agriculture and green space development. It was a step up from his parish job and it was work he cared about. He called me the day he got the offer. "I got the job." "That's amazing," I said. "Are you going to take it? Do you want me to?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes." He moved to New Orleans in September. We found a place together in the Bywater, a shotgun house with a small backyard where Steven immediately started planting things. It wasn't perfect. We argued sometimes. We had to navigate sharing space, merging routines, figuring out how to be partners in a practical, everyday sense. But it was real. It was ours. One evening in October, we were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun set. Steven was watering his tomato plants and I was sanding a piece of wood for a chair I was building. He looked over at me and said, "You know what I love about you?" "What?" "You're not afraid to become who you actually are," I smiled. "I wasn't always like that." "I know," he said. "But you are now." I thought about the person I'd been when I met him. The person who performed, who said yes when he meant no, who chose comfort over truth. I thought about how far I'd come and how much of that journey had been shaped by Steven's quiet, steady belief that I was capable of more. "Thank you," I said. "For what?" "For asking me to be authentic, for not letting me hide," he smiled. "You did the work, I just asked the question." "Still," I said. "Thank you." He walked over and kissed me, and I felt the same sense of rightness I'd felt that first time on the levee. By the end of the year, I'd completed the furniture-making program and started taking on commission work. It wasn't much at first, just small projects for friends and acquaintances. But it was a start. Steven's job was going well. He was leading a project to turn vacant lots in the lower 9th Ward into community gardens. He came home every day exhausted and covered in dirt, and he'd never been happier. We built a life together, a real one. Not one that looked good from the outside, but one that felt good from the inside. One night in December, we were lying in bed. The house was quiet except for the sound of rain on the roof. Steven was almost asleep and I was staring at the ceiling thinking. "Steven," I said, "I'm happy." He opened his eyes and looked at me. Yeah. He smiled and pulled me closer. "Me too," and that was the truth, not the performed version, not the version I told to make things sound easy. The real truth, I was happy, we were happy. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to explain it or justify it or make it sound like anything other than what it was. It was love, it was authenticity, it was home.